Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 124 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Foreign Policy Focus is the podcast where I discuss current events related to foreign policy and international news and then give some analysis on those events. The show can be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or on the libertarianinstitute.org or on iTunes. For today's show, I had originally planned to talk a lot about Africa. I feel like there's several significant events going on around Africa, and I kind of want to touch on that, but then this North Korean missile launch happened, and I know a lot of you listen to, these kind of shows, that way you're able to, engage in the political conversations and be well informed for that kind of stuff, and so this is a, kind of a big current event that's going on right now, so I really want to touch on it first, and then I'll get to the Africa stuff second. Now, just on the, absolute details of the North Korean missile launch test, what they're calling it is an ICBM, and it seems to me more or less, at least the mainstream media is just kind of saying that North Korea has a fully functional ICBM that could hit anywhere in the United States, including Washington DC, Florida, etc. Now, I haven't seen anybody, from the intelligence community come out and say that, because I know a few months back they have been talking about North Korea still being way behind on the research for the re-entry heat nose cone kind of thing for the ICBM. And so regardless if they have built the rocket engines big enough and good enough in order to shoot a missile that could actually hit that far away, that, the nose cone is entirely important and needed, or else it's just gonna burn up on re-entry. So I think that's kind of a critical question that's out there, and maybe we will get some kind of statement from the intelligence community or somebody smart in the know that could come out and say, hey, they do or do not have the nose cone. Also, what the targeting ability of this is. Now, it just seems to me that, if North Korea is firing a missile from North Korea to Washington, D.C., that's an awfully long way to hit something accurately. So I don't know if they have all the ability to do that. And so I think there's several outstanding questions before we just go ahead and blatantly say that, yes, North Korea has an ICBM and could deliver a nuclear weapon to the East Coast, DC, etc. There's also the issue that these, ICBM tests aren't loaded with the actual hydrogen bomb warheads, and those are very, very heavy. And so I guess we at least had to ask the question, are they able to kind of juice the numbers? Does it look like their missile could do more because it is so, it's so light that it's able to go a little bit further? So it's important questions. What we do know is that the missile went pretty high. I haven't seen an exact number on the height, but somebody says about 4 times higher than the International Space Station. So it went good ways up, traveled about 620 miles. From the spot it was launched, apparently landed in waters that are known as kind of Japanese economical waters. I mean, I'm sure this is more or less just kind of Japan owning a little bit of extra territorial waters than anything else, but this is at least enough for the Japanese to make the complaint on the global stage that a North Korean missile landed in Japanese waters. While unlikely, I have talked about how in the past, how the worst thing that I can imagine happening is, for whatever reason, either this missile failing when they were shooting them over Japan, or the missile, having to land on a Japanese ship or something like that. That these missile tests are really, really dangerous. And while it may seem like, they're just a kind of a routine thing at this point, I'm sure that's not the case when Japan, launches the missile, and the United States and South Korea and Japan are all watching their screen trying to decide whether this is an actual first strike by North Korea. Do we need to shoot down this missile? What are all of our options militarily? Where do we go from here? There's a real hold your breath moment. And something like the North Korean missile failing and not necessarily exploding, but landing somewhere in Japan as it's fired over Japan, or, landing on a Japanese ship in the middle of the ocean, the chances of it aren't too great, but I believe these, fears are somewhat valid, and have, even if it's a 1 in a million chance, the effect is that this could be what ignites, the end of civilization. So it's really important to keep in mind. They're calling this missile the, I believe, Hwasong 15, HWASONG, how it's spelled, -15 is the name of the missile. And so I guess as far as my knowledge of missiles, I'm not like a rocket scientist or anything like that, so I really can't give a whole lot of analysis there what's going on with this missile. They said the big technological breakthrough between this missile test and the last one, which I think was a couple months ago, was that the burn on the second stage of the rocket went a lot further. And so they apparently have a better engine they built for these rockets, and that's what's going on. The political fallout, I guess, Trump says, made a little statement, ends, we will take care of it. It seems to me that Trump is intentionally trying to be ambiguous, but not, coming out promising fire and fury again. So it could be a lot worse is what I'm thinking here. The U.S. talked a little bit with the South Koreans. The South Koreans kind of interpreted the threat not to necessarily be that this would provoke North Korea to launch a first strike against South Korea or the U.S., but this might be the catalyst for the United States to feel threatened enough by North Korea to launch a preemptive strike against North Korea. And so the fear isn't really even from the South Korean side that the Kim Jong-un's North Koreans are going to do something irrational. Rather, it be the United States that acts irrationally and causes a big problem. Japan issued statements, was pretty upset about this, hawkish kind of stuff, but not too directly calling for war. Rex Tillerson that said this was a threat to the world. And of course that, the North Koreans kind of said, well, this was a successful test, and so now we've kind of maxed out or completed our nuclear capabilities. I guess North Korea saw kind of their, magical weapon or whatever being a hydrogen bomb that's small enough to fit on the head of an ICBM that could be launched and hit the United States. And whether or not they actually have that, it seems like everybody right now is willing at least to pretend that they do. And so I think that's pretty important, and everybody's acting like North Korea has those capabilities. I still think that the nuclear program, especially the nuclear missile program that North Korea has, really isn't their ace in the hole and isn't really what's keeping North Korea from being attacked. I think all the artillery, like I said, that I pointed out before, that's pointed at Seoul, that's buried deep within the mountains, ranges there. It's extremely dangerous. It's so close to South Korea that it really can't be hit with nuclear weapons, or it would risk nuclear fallout to people in South Korea, including American soldiers stationed there. So that those artillery positions are very important, because I believe there's about 30 million people in South Korea within range of those artillery positions. And the other one being that North Korea would be able to deliver a bomb locally, either to Japan, could target US there, Guam, or South Korea. And then also the possibility of North Korea being able to make something of a submarine and then get that close to the United States and detonate a bomb that way. Overall, the ICBM course just seems like the most unlikely way that North Korea would successfully deliver a strike to the United States even at this point. I don't think there's all that much to fear unless Trump actually follows through with, the different kind of red lines that he's made on North Korea, saying that he wouldn't allow North Korea to threaten the United States. And so if he interprets this as a threat, we could be in trouble. But I think all is good on North Korea at this point. And like I said, it's because North Korea holds, all those artillery positions, all those other trump cards that they see being able to protect them from a U.S. preemptive strike. And that would likely be what ignites a war between the United States and North Korea. Now on to Africa. I wanted to mention first, and probably the small story, is that we had 50 people killed in a terror attack in Nigeria. This was in northern Nigeria, and this is one of those things that seems to happen every few months in Nigeria, where terror groups there make a pretty big statement, killing a lot of people. A lot of times it's either, I guess, ethnic or religious differences that are causing the splits here. I know Boko Haram operates in the area still, and so Boko Haram continues to be a problem really for more Central Africa. And this is the thing, if we're looking at the continent of Africa and how the United States is going to intervene everywhere, we obviously have the long-standing relationship with Egypt. We created the state of South Sudan, the intervention in Libya. Now we're operating in West Africa against the Al-Qaeda groups out there. ISIS exists out there. A lot of this is just kind of flow over from the Libyan war. The United States has a long-standing war against Somalia and Al-Shabaab. And then Boko Haram really operates in Central Africa. And so that's, probably where the U.S. would get involved there. Moving to Egypt, we have 300 plus killed in a huge massacre on a Sufi temple. Sufi is a branch mostly of Sunni Islam that believes in a more mystical view of the religion. I'm not going to pretend to understand Sufi teachings. I've heard some people say they're a little bit more of a peaceful group of Islam, and they've kind of been held up as a beneficial reform to some of the more outdated Islamist teachings. However, I don't know how true all this is. I'm not an Islam scholar, so I really don't want to comment on that. I just want to, kind of put it out there to everybody that this is the narrative and this is how these people are portrayed. I don't think yet the militants have yet been confirmed to be identified. A lot of people have suspected ISIS because ISIS has been operating a lot in the Sinai, and terror groups like ISIS have targeted reformed Sunni groups like the Sufis in the past. So it's really, likely, I guess, that ISIS carried out the attack. But I mean, at this point, unless, we have a confirmation. Also, ISIS is always really quick to jump out and say that they were responsible attack when they were actually responsible for an attack, much like Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And that was part of my analysis on the issue with the large truck bombing in Somalia that killed so many people, was that if Al-Shabaab had done it, they would have been very quick to claim responsibility, and other, things going on suggest at the time that there was probably another culprit. I think this shows kind of some of the problems of Egypt and then the U.S.'s take on the Arab Spring there. We really, didn't support the Arab Spring initially, and then there was elections, and we had the Muslim Brotherhood winning the elections. The United States didn't like that, so then they overthrew that government, and now there's a more or less military government in charge of Egypt. They've completely lost control of this region. Attacks by ISIS groups in the Sinai are pretty common. A lot of times, though, it's not just the religious groups that are targeted. The Egyptian security forces have been targeted several times in the Sinai. They've attacked, I believe, police stations and checkpoints and killed a lot of people that way. It doesn't look like this is going to lead to any additional U.S. interventionism, so that's a good thing. One of the other big things about this is that for the first time in a long time, the Egyptians were going to open the border crossing between Gaza, which is, the Palestinian open air prison in what, is more or less southern Israel, and the Sinai, which would allow a lot of people to get out and visit family in other places in the world, and, probably get some pretty necessary food, medicine, resources that they could bring back in. However, because this attack happened, that border crossing remains closed. Gaza's a really terrible place to live. Their houses have been bombed. They can't import any concrete to, rebuild the houses. I think they only have electricity a couple hours a day now because they have so little fuel. So, it's really just awful. In Zimbabwe, we have more or less looks like the conclusion of the coup to get rid of former President Robert Mugabe, who was the president of Zimbabwe for over 20 years. The new president has been sworn in. His name is Emerson Mnangagwa, Mnangawa, if you want to look it up. And he will be the new president of Zimbabwe. He seems to want to move on from the whole Mugabe issue. He was the former vice president, revolutionary friend of Mugabe. It also looks like Mugabe will not face any charges for any corrupt actions he carried out while president of Zimbabwe or any other war crimes like that. And while that's unfortunate, I guess, if we look at this in the case of if this was the easiest transition, the best way to bring about peace in Zimbabwe, then hopefully that's what we get. I have no idea if the new government's going to be any better than the old government. Something tells me it won't be much better, but maybe it'll be a little bit better. When you have a president entrenched in power for so long, I'm sure there were a lot of just like little rackets and stuff that may now get knocked out, and new rackets will form over time, but there may be a general lull in corruption in Zimbabwe. It doesn't look like any meaningful reforms or any changes on a large scale are going to be implemented as far as I could tell. That being said, this is an issue that is pretty hard to find a lot of analysis on, so we could find that this guy, eventually has a pretty different ideology. Then in Kenya, we have what is the end of a months-long election process. The Kenyans originally held their elections in August, and a man named Uhuru Kenyatta won the election. However, the opposition said the elections were good. There was a lot of voting tampering going on, which just generally looking at how, some of these African elections have gone over time, it wouldn't be surprising to me that one, if not both sides, are tampering with the election. There's always allegations in all the other countries too. The United States gets them where they say people are bussed over state lines to vote and et cetera, illegal immigrants vote. So there's always calls into question the legitimacy of the elections. And I'm sure in this one there was places to find legitimate cheating going on. The High Court of Kenya ruled that there was going to be, I guess, a re-election vote. During this time, there was a good amount of protesting going on. A lot of people were really upset. The opposition then announced that they were going to boycott the election. They said that they were going to boycott the election because they felt like whatever changes need to be made to make this election more legitimate than the previous election that obviously wasn't legitimate enough for the high court, wasn't made. So they needed to have those changes made before holding an election. I'm sure the counter argument is that they just say that because they know they were going to lose again. And so by saying that they, protest the vote and don't show up, it kind of de facto makes the election somewhat delegitimate and, creates some problems as to, well, who's actually, has the will of the people behind him. There was somewhat significant protesting at the inauguration, which finally happened. The opposition called for the elections to remain peaceful, and they seem to generally have been so. However, 3 people were killed in protesting. One 7-year-old boy was shot. It does look like this was related to the shots being fired by police, but I didn't read any confirmation that this was definitely a police-involved shooting. In Kenyatta's inauguration speech, he talked a lot about criticizing the Supreme Court and then talking about how his opponents just need to accept that he's the new president there. So those are several places around Africa where I feel like there's some pretty significant events going on. We also had the French president visiting countries out in West Africa. I had briefly mentioned how Al-Qaeda groups and ISIS groups mostly spilled over from the Libyan civil war are fighting out there now. The French government says there's not enough being done. Of course, there's a 5-country coalition formed out there to try to fight these groups. And apparently the United States is heavily involved in it. We'll see in the future if, the French maybe push the United States' carts carrying out some drone strikes out that way. This is something that I think most Americans just would guess was untrue. We kind of had the idea the peace-loving French, more or less, that are too afraid to get their fingernails dirty fighting in a war, but here we had the French really pushing for imperialism and interventionism in North Africa. Alright, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. A couple things. I'm trying to do a show format where I'm talking about a fewer number of stories, but, kind of focusing on one thing. Like today, I was really focusing on Africa, even though I spent half the show on North Korea because that was a big event, rather than briefly detailing a bunch of little stories. Let me know what you think. If you'd rather me do it the other way as I was doing before, I'll keep doing it that way. Other stuff, maybe I could do a Q&A or something like that. If anybody is interested in that, shoot me a message. Best place, join Foreign Policy Focus. You ask me any questions there, I'll probably answer them for you in the group. Then I could even address them on the air as well if I have more to say about it. If you like the show, please share it. I'm not doing donations or anything like that right now. I'm just, asking that you share the show and help it to grow. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. I'm on the libertarianinstitute.org, which is a great project hosted by Scott Horn. I'm, so happy to, be a part of it and getting to post all my content there. So check that out. The show has like a little featured area on the homepage right under Scott Horton's show. While you're there, you can check out my news roundups. They go up here on the libertarianinstitute.org and on kylesfilesblog.com. My Twitter is at KYAAALE. I am making an effort to be a little bit more active on Twitter, retweeting some stuff I find funny. So again, I had a bunch of good ones there. I retweeted about Thomas Friedman's article on NBS that most of you will probably find funny. And have a good week. I'll be back on Friday.